else when it comes to like AAA studios and big corpos, and I don't know how their brains work, like what their thinking is. Like if let's say they start out with like a 200 person studio, this quite a lot of people. If they double that, you're not going to get another 200 people worth of output out of that.
You never are.
It's diminishing, and I don't know. It's just something that always confused me because like I'm a nobody. I'm a small guy. You know, I'm additional programming by. I hop around from game to game to game to game to game in indies. So it's like I don't know that part of the business end, but I see them as making a whole lot of mistakes, and I'm curious if in the future, especially with the way 2024 has been, like, do we expect the AAA industry to course correct in any way, and like how long do we think that would take, even if they're going to do it? That's something that I've been thinking about.
I think it's likely, but it's hard, so it may take a long time. And then we didn't talk about, actually, I meant to mention this in the earlier discussion, but it also applies to this. So I'll circle back to that for a second, right? Most AAA games have been pretty disappointing, and I think a lot of them have not done well in the past couple of years, last year especially. But some are more successful than ever. So like Fortnite's doing great, for example, right? In part, I think because it's a game that established itself and people know they can go back there and get, you know, basically the game that they enjoy with some minor changes every once in a while when there's an update. And it's sort of become people's hobby or whatever, right? And that maybe kind of sucks the air out of the room out of a lot of these other games as well, right? But so circling back to this question of like, is the AAA industry going to have to correct? That's sort of how economics works, right? Is just if people won't pay for your thing, you're not going to be able to do it. And you might get one or two cracks at it, but pretty soon, if you don't get the money back to do more of the thing, you won't be able to do the thing, right? And so, you know, so what does that mean? If you're making one of these games that didn't do well, one of the things you would try to do is try to make something that more people are likely to enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. And there are several dimensions to that. There's like, what is the design? What is the visual style? What is the story, right? Maybe pick things that people are going to like more. But there's also things that are harder, like what is the actual quality of the game? Like you could have a good idea for the art and the story and the characters, but like then the implementation kind of sucks and the game's unplayable and janky, and it'll probably do poorly, right? In that case. So that's something that needs to get fixed. And then on this question of how many people does it take to make a game? Well, there's a lot of reasons why people think that number is high. One of them is it's a fact about paying people to do things that you always can see what you would do with more help, right? Because these projects take a long time, they're hard. Sometimes things don't go well. You're like, man, if we had an extra 2 programmers. Then you get them and you're like, man, if we had an extra 2 programmers, right? Yep. And it just keeps going like that, right? But then there's also a lot of what you would call perverse incentives that happen at all large companies, right? So let's say, in theory, people are stymied by this sometimes because it appears to be a paradox at a high level, right? So like the point of capitalism is supposed to be that you want to make a profit, and that means you want to make a thing people like that's hopefully high quality, some combination of high quality or cheap, right? If it's super cheap, it doesn't have to be as good, right? But like you want to make the thing as cheaply as you can because that's better for you, right? As a company, you take more profit home, right? But when you look internally to a company, let's say someone's a middle manager within this company. What does that person want? Do they want the game to be good? Or whatever, the website to be good, or, you know, because we're talking more generally. Sure, maybe, but really they also want their career to advance, and they probably have ego issues, and they want to feel more important, and they want to make more money. And how do you do that? Well, if you lead more people, then you're more important, right? And so managers always have an incentive to grow their groups. And then especially, there's this really bad budgeting practice that a lot of companies have where it's like, if you don't spend, we gave you a budget for 2024, and if you didn't spend it all, then that obviously is how much you need. So we're going to give you this decreased budget for 2025, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody knows that. And so they spend their whole budget, which not only is bad because in that moment you spend more money than you needed to spend, but it leads to a disrespect for expenditure, right? Like at some level, money is the blood of the company, right? And so you should be very careful about it. And it leads to an internal culture where that's not the case at all, right? And so there's lots of other weird stuff that happens inside companies too. Now that a lot of people work, like if I ran a big company, the number one thing I would do is declare a return to work in the office policy. And I can't actually do that because my company's too small. I would like to figure out how to do it longer term though, because it's the only way that people will really work at the efficiency that they worked in the past. Because, a small percentage of people are better just at home on their own recognizance, right? But most people are less efficient, honestly.
I would think adding to that,
substantially less.
Yeah, creativity also, being around other people, being able to quickly toss ideas back and forth without doing it through email or Zoom meetings. It's so much nicer.
Going back to the passion and inspiration that you were talking about, like we're human beings, and if you're like next to somebody and you could like feel the energy of what they're doing, that communicates better. It passes between people better. If you can look around and it's like, wow, everybody's doing something cool today, that really works. It's a lot harder just because we're embodied human beings. It's a lot harder if you're just looking at Slack or even a video call or something. Our brains don't work that way. You don't get that inspiration, Yeah. And then like when you've got all these remote workers, you have to have extra structure to police the remote workers to make sure that you kick people out if they're not working. And that's really unpleasant and takes resources. And most companies are trying to be nice because, there was this idea going way back that games industry had too much of a crunch culture. And there was a lot of really bad press about that from, I don't know, even really going back to probably 2010, but around 2014 to 2017, when the press got really anti-games industry, but the games industry hadn't started rejecting the press yet. Because at some point, like, it's fine to be critical of the industry and all that, but you got to be fair, right?
Yeah.
And at some point with the journalists who were sort of in office at that time, it wasn't really about being fair. It was just about finding what you can criticize today because that generated clicks, right? And so I think most people in the industry now realize that old model of gaming press is still deeply unfair. And, different parties have reacted to that in different ways.
Very much so.
But
it's much more incestuous between, I think, especially a lot of the big corpos and a lot of the big media outlets. There's definitely a lot of nepotism going on back and forth.
Yeah, for sure. But going back to then, there was still this idea, though, that like, if they're criticizing our work policy, if we have a better work policy, they'll stop criticizing us or whatever. And that's not how it works at all. They just find a different thing, right? And it is true that there was a little bit too much crunch culture in notorious places, but and poor management leading to people working too much and all that. But the games industry is a really big industry, and honestly, the vast majority of it was fine, And also, I think there should be a place like, look, so SpaceX is like this, right? You only go work at SpaceX if you know that you want to work like 12-hour days or more, right? With extreme crunch sometimes, because like they're on a mission to like get to Mars and there's a deadline, right? And all this stuff. For the minority of people who want to do that, I'm all in favor of that actually, because It's like going to boot camp and then, going to SEAL training or something, right? Like SEAL training isn't about working 4 hours a day and taking a lot of naps, right? It's really hard. And most people don't make it, but like you go there because you want to be the really good version of that, right? And I wish we consciously cultivated that in the games industry more. And to be honest, I might have a vague plan about something like that later on. We'll see. But that shouldn't be right. Most of the industry shouldn't be like that. And you should know it going in. It shouldn't be a thing where it's like, I thought this was a normal job, and then I was pressured coercively into working extra, or I would be fired, or whatever. And that probably did happen a little bit in the industry, but it was not super widespread. But so the industry overreacted, and now everybody has been trying to be super progressive and all that, and that leads to not calling people on it when they're not really doing work, right? And so that massively bloats the budget of these games, which if you're a gamer, think about it this way, right? If a game used to cost $60, right? But now, to make an equivalent game this year, the team is only half as efficient at making the game. They only put in half as many hours on average, which is probably realistic. Either the game's going to be half as good or half as much work, or it's going to cost $100, right? Before you even get to inflation or anything, right? This is just like, how many people does it take to make the game? And I think that's another thing that hit the industry really hard, is these bigger companies have been very slow to notice that a lot of people just actually aren't really doing very much work. And also, there were lots of reasons why you could see that they were letting this happen for a while. Like, you go into COVID and everyone has all these dramatic things to know. I mean, the summer of 2020, or, the first 6 months of 2020 was crazy, right? And there were all these distractions and people were having a hard time a lot of the time. And you want to be good to people, and, you don't want to like crack a whip over somebody when they're having a really bad time. And so there's legit reasons for that, but like, it's sort of, sort of the way 2 weeks to flatten the curve turned into a lot longer than that. If it's like, okay, people are going to be unproductive this week because something really dramatic is happening. If like 6 months later, you're still doing that, something's starting to be really wrong.
To some people,
especially
we're
at
about
the budget
to have 5
levels of
years,
these companies.